The ocean stretched endlessly under a cloudless sky, its calm surface belying the storm that was about to erupt. It was June 1942, just 6 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. The Pacific had become a chessboard of war, and every move now carried the weight of empires. Deep within this vast expanse of blue, a deadly game of deception and destruction was unfolding, one that would shape the very course of World War II. This is the gripping story of the Battle of Midway. At the heart of the Japanese plan was a trap. After months of rapid conquests across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy aimed to deliver a final, decisive blow to the United States. Their target was Midway Atoll, a remote but strategically critical outpost west of Hawaii. Japan's goal was not just to seize territory. It was to lure the American aircraft carriers into open waters, crush them, and eliminate any remaining naval resistance. If successful, Japan would gain uncontested control over the Pacific, possibly even threaten the U.S. mainland. But what the Japanese High Command did not know was that their secret was already out. American codebreakers had intercepted and deciphered Japan's plans. With this intelligence in hand, the U.S. Navy laid its own trap. What followed was not just a naval engagement, it was a high-stakes showdown of strategy, timing, and human resilience. It would become one of the most astonishing military turnarounds in modern history. In the span of just a few days, the tide of war in the Pacific would shift dramatically. Carrier-based aircraft, not battleships, would determine the outcome. Heroic pilots would fly into near-certain death, and commanders on both sides would make split-second decisions that would change the fate of nations. The Battle of Midway was not just about ships and bombs, it was about courage, foresight, and the hidden power of intelligence. Today, we dive deep into this iconic battle, exploring not just what happened, but why it mattered. We will uncover the strategies, the mistakes, and the moments of valor that defined Midway. You will meet the people who stood at the edge of history and made choices that echoed far beyond the ocean. If you are fascinated by true stories of resilience, ingenuity, and turning points in global history, you are in the right place. Hit that like button to support the channel. And do not forget to subscribe so you do not miss any of our future deep dives into the moments that changed the world. Let us set sail into the Pacific and relive the battle that turned the tide of World War II. As the Japanese fleet surged across the Pacific toward Midway, their confidence was unshakable. Fresh off months of unbroken victories, from the fall of Singapore to the capture of the Philippines, they believed their dominance at sea was all but assured. Their plan, as daring as it was intricate, reflected that confidence. It was a strategy built on overwhelming force, cunning misdirection, and surgical precision. But within its complexity lay a fatal flaw. The operation was known as Me, and at its heart was a sweeping maneuver to encircle and annihilate the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Japan's goal was to strike Midway Island with one powerful arm of the Navy while luring the remaining American carriers into a kill zone with another. To achieve this, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the plan and commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, divided his naval power into multiple task forces, each assigned a specific role. There was the 1st Carrier Striking Force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, which would deliver the initial blow to Midway. Then came the main body, commanded by Yamamoto himself, trailing far behind and waiting for the right moment to spring into action. A separate group, the Northern Force, was dispatched to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to create a diversion. Supporting units, including battleships, cruisers, submarines, and the Midway invasion fleet, were spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. To Yamamoto, this dispersion was a masterpiece of deception, an elegant demonstration of maneuver warfare at sea. Yet what it gained in surprise, it sacrificed in unity. By stretching his forces across such vast distances, Yamamoto ensured that each unit operated in isolation, unable to support the others when the battle began. in a war where seconds could decide the fate of ships and lives. The Japanese fleet's inability to quickly mass its strength would prove disastrous. In stark contrast, the American response was compact, deliberate, and informed, thanks to intelligence breakthroughs at Station Hypo in Hawaii. Navy cryptanalysts had successfully broken the Japanese naval code in 25. They knew the attack was coming. More importantly, they knew exactly where it would come. Admiral Cheatham, Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, seized this critical advantage. He dispatched his limited carrier force Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown to lie in wait northeast of Midway, far from where the Japanese expected. Unlike Yamamoto, Nimitz kept his forces tightly grouped, able to move and respond as one. This difference in approach dispersal versus concentration would shape the course of the battle before a single shot was fired. While the Japanese fleet was sprawling across the Pacific like a net cast too wide, the American task force was a fist, clenched and ready to strike. Rear Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the U.S. carriers, worked in close coordination, constantly exchanging reconnaissance updates and adjusting tactics in real time. Every ship and every aircraft was part of a singular, coordinated strategy. As dawn broke on June 4, the vulnerability of Japan's scattered formation became all too real. Vice Admiral Naguma, in charge of the 4 frontline carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Heryu, was already engaged in the initial attack on Midway Island. His pilots had launched a wave of bombers and fighters just hours earlier, striking American positions but failing to eliminate all air defenses. He now faced a dilemma: rearm his aircraft for another strike on the island, or hold torpedoes ready in case American ships appeared. What he did not know was that, even then, carriers were positioning themselves for a counterattack. Because Yamamoto's main force and support units were hundreds of miles away, Nagumo stood virtually alone at the decisive point of contact. There would be no quick reinforcements, no immediate backup if things went wrong. When American torpedo bombers appeared on the horizon, they came in waves, ill-equipped and flying outdated aircraft, but determined. While their attacks scored no direct hits, they forced Nagumo's combat air patrol to descend to sea level, chasing the low-flying torpedo planes. And in that critical window, American dive bombers arrived from high above, unseen until it was too late. In a span of 5 devastating minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were mortally wounded. Bombs tore through flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, igniting infernos that could not be contained. Without coordination, without immediate support, Nagumo's fleet could only endure the onslaught. Heryu, the sole surviving carrier, managed to launch a retaliatory strike that temporarily crippled us Yorktown. But by the end of the day, it too was burning and sinking beneath the waves. This was the price of dispersion, isolation, delay, and irreversible loss. While Yamamoto's strategy had counted on surprise and superior numbers, it had overlooked the importance of concentrated force and rapid communication. In war, especially at sea, unity of action often determines who prevails and who falls. The American fleet, though numerically inferior in many respects, had seized the advantage through clarity of purpose and cohesion. They moved as one, struck as one, and overcame overwhelming odds with precision. What might have been a catastrophic defeat was transformed into one of the most significant victories in naval history, not through brute strength alone, but through the power of staying unified when it mattered most. In the lead-up to the climactic clash at Midway, it was not just firepower or daring pilots that tilted the balance. It was something far less visible yet profoundly more decisive: intelligence. Deep within a handful of cramped, secret rooms in Pearl Harbor and Washington, D.C., a small group of American codebreakers had been laboring around the clock. They were not flying planes or commanding fleets, but their work would shape the fate of nations. Among them was a brilliant officer named Joseph Rochefort, whose analytical mind had helped crack the Japanese naval code known as Genin 25. Through relentless effort and nights filled with static-laced transmissions and cryptic number groups, these codebreakers had begun to uncover a ghostly outline of Japan's next move. The Japanese had codenamed their target F and US. Intelligence suspected it was Midway, but they could not be sure, so they set a trap. A false message was transmitted from Midway, claiming the island's water purification system had failed. Shortly after, a Japanese communication was intercepted, noting that F was short on water. That was the confirmation they needed. Midway was the target, and the Imperial Navy was heading straight for it. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his commanders were able to prepare not just a defense, but an ambush. It was as if they had been handed the enemy's battle plan in advance. They knew the approximate date, the direction, the size of the force, and even the composition of the Japanese fleet. This intelligence gave the US Navy a rare opportunity, the chance to be outnumbered but not outmaneuvered. As the Japanese fleet moved forward under the confident command of Admiral Yamamoto, they believed they held the advantage. Their plan was complex and ambitious, involving multiple task forces spread across a vast expanse of ocean. But this very complexity became a weakness. Their forces were dispersed and their coordination hindered, while the US fleet, aware of the plan, remained tightly concentrated and ready to strike. The result was a game of deception, surprise, and calculated timing. American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown took up hidden positions northeast of Midway, with land-based aircraft on the island and submarines patrolling the seas. The US had constructed a layered defense built on knowledge rather than guesswork. When the battle began on June 4, 1942, it did not unfold in Japan's favor. Their initial airstrike against Midway caused damage, but not enough to knock out the island's defenses. As Japanese commanders debated a second strike, American scout planes located their carriers. Within hours, American dive bombers, having endured chaotic orders and miscommunication, suddenly broke through the clouds to find the Japanese carriers' vulnerable decks full of refueling and roaming planes, bombs scattered like kindling. It was in these moments that the intelligence advantage bore fruit. The timing of the American attack was nearly miraculous. But it was not luck alone, it was the product of positioning, planning, and readiness born of foreknowledge. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Tsurai were in flames. The final carrier, Harry, would launch a desperate counterattack and manage to strike the Yorktown. But it too would fall by the following day. The victory at Midway was not just a tactical win. It was a turning point in the Pacific War. It shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and shifted the momentum to the Allies. 4 irreplaceable Japanese carriers were lost along with hundreds of experienced pilots and crew assets that Japan could not replenish. Meanwhile, American morale surged. The tide had turned, and behind it all, like shadows guiding the course of history, were the codebreakers. Their work had allowed a vastly outnumbered fleet to stand ready in precisely the right place, at precisely the right time. Without their insight, the story of Midway might have ended very differently. The moment American aircraft sighted the incoming Japanese fleet near Midway, a chain reaction was set into motion that would alter the course of the Pacific War. The significance of this sighting was not merely tactical, it was the culmination of months of intense preparation. Intelligence, gathering, and quiet anticipation. Every signal intercepted, every radio message decrypted by US codebreakers, and every movement anticipated by naval strategists had led to this critical juncture. The enemy was coming, and this time, the Americans were ready. Midway, a remote atoll in the Pacific Ocean, had become a focal point for both the Japanese and American war efforts. The Japanese sought to draw out the remaining US aircraft carriers and destroy them in a decisive battle, hoping to extend their defensive perimeter and demoralize the American public. For the United States, Midway represented both a symbolic and strategic linchpin. If it fell, Hawaii and perhaps the entire Pacific defense could be at risk. When American reconnaissance planes spotted the formation of Japanese ships, the U.S. Navy sprang into action with remarkable coordination. Admiral Chester Nimitz, overseeing the Pacific Fleet, had already positioned his limited number of carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway, in an ambush position based on intelligence that predicted the timing and direction of the Japanese attack. The sighting confirmed the codebreaker's analysis. It was now or never. On Midway itself, Marines, Navy personnel, and Army Air Forces braced for impact. Pilots stood ready in cockpits, maintenance crews rushed final checks, and island defenses were brought to full alert. Every available resource was committed, no reserves held back, no chances taken. Even obsolete aircraft and undertrained pilots were readied, not out of overconfidence, but because the stakes left no room for hesitation. At sea, the mood was electric. American sailors and airmen, many young and facing combat for the first time, felt the tension in their bones. But it was not fear that defined them, it was resolve. They knew the Japanese fleet they were about to confront was formidable. It included 4 of the carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their names Keiji, Kaga, Soryu, and Heryu were etched in the minds of every man who had seen the smoke rising from Battleship Row just 6 months earlier. This was a chance not only to strike back but to begin to turn the tide. The American plan relied on surprise, timing, and sheer determination. Aircraft were launched in waves from Midway and the carriers. These early attacks, though often poorly coordinated and flying without sufficient escort, served to harass and distract the Japanese fleet. Torpedo squadrons flew low and slow, presenting easy targets for the experienced Japanese Zero pilots. Many of these brave men never returned, but their sacrifice was not in vain. As Japanese defensive fighters were drawn to low altitudes to counter the torpedo planes, American dive bombers arrived from high above. The timing was almost miraculous. In a matter of minutes, the tide turned with explosive fury. Bombs rained down on the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, igniting fuel and munitions. These massive vessels, the pride of the Japanese carrier fleet, were engulfed in flames and rendered helpless. Back on Midway, the defenders watched anxiously as the battle unfolded beyond the horizon. Reports crackled through radios, each update a mix of triumph and tragedy. The island had endured bombing, but it stood firm. The Japanese, thrown into disarray by the sudden and catastrophic loss of their carriers, struggled to regroup. Only the Heryu remained operational, and though it launched a counterstrike that severely damaged the Yorktown, it too would soon meet the same fate as its sister ships. Throughout the day, the skies above Midway and the waters surrounding it bore witness to fierce combat. Dogfights erupted as fighters clashed, and the sea itself became a graveyard for men and machines alike. Yet amidst the chaos, the American resolve never wavered. Pilots returned with empty fuel tanks, shot up wings, and shaken nerves, only to refuel and take off again. Damage control teams fought fires aboard the carriers with bare hands and buckets. Every person involved, whether in the air, at sea, or on land, knew that this was no ordinary engagement. This was a pivotal moment in the war. As night fell, the enormity of the American achievement began to set in. 4 Japanese carriers had been lost, along with hundreds of experienced pilots and crew assets Japan could not easily replace. The U.S., though battered, had held Midway and preserved 2 of its own carriers. For the first time in the Pacific, Japan had been decisively defeated. The balance had shifted. The success at Midway was not the result of a single event, but of a mosaic of factors: intelligence, courage, sacrifice, and strategy. And it all hinged on that critical moment when American aircraft first spotted the enemy fleet. In that instant, everything changed. The trap was sprung, the battle joined, and the course of history forever altered. Japan's plan to dominate the Pacific had always rested on precision. deception, and the bold execution of overwhelming force. But as the calendar turned to June 1942, the sprawling blueprint that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had so meticulously crafted began to fray under the pressure of timing, distance, and the unpredictability of war. The plan was undeniably intricate, designed not only to capture Midway and draw out what remained of the American fleet, but also to scatter and mislead US forces through a concurrent attack on the Aleutian Islands. This diversion was meant to stretch the US Pacific Fleet thin, pulling its attention northward while the main blow fell upon Midway, the true prize. In theory, the strategy was elegant. In practice, it was brittle. Yamamoto, commanding the largest Japanese naval operation since Pearl Harbor, had divided his forces across thousands of miles of ocean. The northern force under Vice Admiral Bashiro Hosagaya steamed toward the Aleutians to occupy Attu and Kiska, while the powerful Midway invasion force, led by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, advanced toward the Central Pacific, protected by the formidable 1st Carrier Striking Force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Yamamoto himself commanded the main body, a powerful reserve of battleships and cruisers, including the fearsome Yamato, but he remained hundreds of miles behind the front lines, where his influence would be more theoretical than tangible once the battle was underway. It was a gamble. Yamamoto believed the Americans would take the bait, splitting their already strained fleet to cover both northern and central fronts, and thus walk into a trap at Midway. Yet what he did not know, what no Japanese admiral yet grasped, was that American codebreakers had already unraveled the puzzle. Intelligence had intercepted enough fragments of Japanese communication to determine the target was Midway, not some vague objective as initially suspected. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz made a bold decision. He would not only defend Midway but ambush the ambushers. With the American fleet now hidden northeast of Midway, the balance of surprise had shifted. Still, Yamamoto proceeded as if the U.S. Navy were unaware of his moves. Nagumo's carriers Aki, Kaga, Soryu, and Heryu approached Midway confident in their overwhelming air superiority. Yet the coordination between Japan's forces was never as seamless as their admirals hoped. Each task force operated under strict radio silence, further isolating them from each other and from Yamamoto's central command. When battle commenced, Yamamoto's distance became not only a tactical inconvenience but a strategic liability. Kurita's cruisers, part of the invasion escort, were far from the action. Kondo's invasion fleet advanced methodically but slowly, awaiting confirmation that Midway's defenses had been neutralized. Meanwhile, Nagumo's carriers launched the first assault on Midway on June 4, expecting to cripple American airfields. Instead, they found themselves under near constant counterattack, while land-based bombers from Midway struck in waves mostly ineffective but relentless U.S. carrier-based aircraft, including the now legendary torpedo squadrons, zeroed in on the Japanese fleet. It was during these critical hours that Yamamoto's absence became most keenly felt. A centralized command could have reordered the deployment, committed reinforcements, or at the very least adjusted to the unexpected tempo of American response. But Yamamoto, aboard the Yamato, would not even learn the full extent of Nagumo's crisis until it was too late. By the time the dive bombers from US Enterprise and US Yorktown struck home, 3 Japanese carriers were ablaze. The fate of the 4th, Heryu, would be sealed later that day. The breakdown in communication among Japanese forces and the geographical dispersion of their fleets turned what could have been a calculated blow into a chaotic retreat. Yamamoto eventually ordered the cancellation of the Midway invasion and a general withdrawal. But the command came only after the situation had become irreparable. His grand plan, beautiful on paper, precise in its choreography, had failed under the weight of its own complexity and the unforgiving vastness of the Pacific. The Battle of Midway was not just a clash of steel and fire but a battle of foresight and flexibility, where the Japanese forces operated under assumptions and rigid hierarchy. The Americans adapted in real time, exploiting every misstep. Yamamoto's gamble built on the foundation of surprise, crumbled when that element was lost. His dispersion of forces, meant to ensure dominance across a broad front, instead diluted his striking power at the decisive moment. What remained in the days that followed were the ruins of an overextended strategy. 4 carriers lost, over 3,000 men gone, and the myth of Japanese naval invincibility shattered in a matter of hours. The failure to consolidate command, the inability of distant admirals like Kurita and Kondo to support the main action, and Yamamoto's delayed reaction to unfolding events all combined to rewrite the narrative of the Pacific War. The tide had turned not just through superior firepower or luck, but through the cracks in a meticulously drawn plan that proved impossible to execute from afar. As the early morning haze drifted over the Pacific, Admiral Chechi Nagumo stood aboard the flagship Akagi, unaware that his next decisions would tilt the balance of the Pacific War. The Battle of Midway had only just begun, but already it teetered on the knife's edge of fate. Japan's ambitious offensive, carefully orchestrated with precision and a series of coordinated movements across vast ocean fronts, depended on flawless execution. And yet, amid the swirling fog of war, hesitation and second-guessing would prove costlier than bullets. Just hours earlier, Nagumo had launched the initial wave of planes toward Midway Island. The attack had done damage, but not enough. Reconnaissance had reported that several American facilities were still operational. What Nagumo did not yet know, however, was that a far more dangerous threat loomed not on the island but from the sea. American carriers were out there, somewhere, hidden in the vast Pacific expanse. At this critical juncture, Nagumo faced a dilemma. His flight decks were bustling with activity. His aircraft freshly returned from the Midway strike were being rammed. Originally loaded with bombs for ground targets, they were now being switched to torpedoes in preparation for a potential naval engagement. But then came an unsettling report: Midway had not been neutralized. If the airfield still posed a threat, should the second strike focus on land again? Or should he continue preparations for an attack on enemy ships? Time pressed forward, but clarity did not follow. Nagumo vacillated. The planes were half-rammed when new intelligence finally arrived. An American fleet had been spotted. The situation had flipped again. Orders rang out to reverse the ramming process once more. Mechanics scrambled to remove bombs and replace them with torpedoes. Sweating under the pressure and the tropical heat, every minute lost meant potential disaster. And Nagumo's carriers sat vulnerable, caught in the worst possible moment when aircraft were not in the air, but lined up on the decks, fueled and armed, waiting for orders. This window of vulnerability, born from indecision and miscommunication, proved to be a fatal one. American carrier-based dive bombers, having navigated through misdirections and luck, appeared suddenly in the skies above. The Japanese combat air patrol had been pulled low to intercept torpedo bombers, leaving the skies open above for a deadly attack. Within moments, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were ablaze, engulfed by exploding aviation fuel and munitions. The Akagi, Kaga, and Shrike were all mortally wounded. Harry, the lone survivor, launched counterattacks, but the tide had already turned irreversibly. Nagumo's decision-making had not occurred in a vacuum. The broader context of Japan's strategy, directed from afar by Admiral Yamamoto, was predicated on luring the American fleet into a trap. The plan was elegant in theory: diversionary attacks in the Aleutians, submarine picket lines to detect enemy movements, and a swift, overwhelming blow at Midway. But the Japanese command structure placed critical decision-making authority in the hands of field commanders like Nagumo, while senior strategists remained hundreds of miles away, unreachable in real time. Communication lags and fragmented intelligence turned what should have been a cohesive assault into a patchwork of disconnected movements. And yet, the fatal moment at Midway boiled down to a single delay: an hour, perhaps less, when planes were being switched from one role to another. That pause, compounded by confusion and a lack of real-time reconnaissance, exposed the Japanese carriers at precisely the wrong moment. It was not that Nagumo lacked courage or ability. He was, after all, a veteran of Pearl Harbor. But in the fog of war, it is not always the bravest or most experienced who prevail, but those who act decisively with incomplete information. Historians would later debate whether Nagumo's hesitation was born of caution or of adherence to doctrine. Either way, his reluctance to gamble on an early strike against an uncertain threat allowed the Americans to seize the initiative. Admiral Spruance and the American task force acted with clarity and speed, striking while Nagumo's fleet was in disarray. The result was a staggering blow not just in ships lost, but in momentum. Midway did not merely mark the end of Japanese expansion, it shifted the psychological balance of the Pacific War. In the aftermath, the Japanese Navy would never again launch an offensive on the same scale. Veteran pilots perished, ships were irreplaceable, and the myth of Japanese naval invincibility was shattered. For the men aboard the carriers, the delay in arming the planes was not just a tactical error, it became a matter of life and death. Fires raged through the hangars, escape routes were blocked, and explosions tore through the steel hulls. Survivors would speak of the cows, the desperate attempts to save comrades, and the eerie silence that followed when the sea finally consumed the mightiest ships of the Imperial Navy. As Nagumo watched the destruction unfold, there was little left to command. In a few short hours, the architect of Pearl Harbor had become a figure of tragic miscalculation. The Battle of Midway was won not just by skill or strength, but by speed, resolve, and a touch of fortune, qualities that, on that fateful morning, were not with Nagumo. At dawn on June 4, 1942, with the sun rising over the vast Pacific horizon, the stillness of the sea belied the fury about to unfold. The Japanese fleet, under Admiral Nagumo, was unaware that its carefully crafted offensive would soon be challenged not just by American aircraft but by bold, desperate choices that defied conventional tactics. Aboard the carriers of Task Force 17, American commanders were piecing together a plan as fragile as it was daring. The U.S. Navy, having deciphered Japanese communications, knew the enemy's target and was willing to gamble everything to stop them. From the decks of the U.S. Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, waves of aircraft roared into the sky. Among them were the torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadrons 8, 6, and 3 flying the slow, outdated Douglas II Devastators. These machines were relics of a different era, outclassed in speed, range, and defensive capabilities. Yet, these crews understood the weight of their mission. They were to dive straight into the heart of the enemy fleet, hoping to cripple Japan's carriers before they could launch another wave. As they flew low over the churning ocean, the odds stacked against them grew more grim. Lacking adequate fighter escort, the Devastator squadrons became easy prey for the Japanese Zeros that formed a lethal aerial shield around the carriers. Still, the Americans pressed on. But the torpedo bombers were picked off. Torpedo 8 from the U.S. Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, flew into the teeth of the enemy defenses without hesitation. All 15 planes were shot down. Not a single torpedo found its mark. Only one man survived. To an outside observer, the mission appeared a tragic failure. But hidden within this sacrifice lay a turning point. The relentless assault of the torpedo squadrons had disrupted the cohesion of Japanese defenses. The Zero fighters were drawn low, chasing the lumbering Devastators, leaving the skies above exposed and vulnerable. Japanese commanders had expected any follow-up attacks to come hours later, not stacked in rapid succession. This timing was no coincidence. It was the result of meticulous coordination and the bravery of American aviators who understood that their mission was not solely about hitting targets, but about sowing confusion and pulling apart Japan as deadly precision. As the last Devastator fell into the sea, the second wave of American planes emerged, not more torpedo bombers, but dive bombers, the Douglas Speed Dauntless, flying high and mostly undetected. Their arrival caught the Japanese completely off guard. Below, on the decks of the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, chaos reigned. Admiral Nagumo had already been forced into difficult decisions earlier in the morning. After the initial Japanese attack on Midway, Reports suggested that the American airfield had not been fully neutralized. Simultaneously, he learned that enemy ships might be approaching. Uncertain and lacking concrete intelligence, Nagumo reversed earlier decisions, ordering aircraft that had been rammed with torpedoes to be changed back to bombs, and then again to torpedoes. The result was a cluttered flight deck and hangars packed with fuel lines, armed bombs, and disassembled aircraft. Just as these preparations reached their most vulnerable stage, the dauntless dive bombers arrived in formation. With the Zeros dragged low by the torpedo bombers, there was little to stop the high-altitude attack. At 10:22, in a moment that would forever alter the trajectory of the Pacific War, the dive bombers screamed down from the sky. One-but, they struck with surgical precision. Explosions tore through the decks of the Kaga and Akagi. Fuel and munitions turned the carriers into floating infernos. Within minutes, the might of Japan's naval air power was engulfed in flame. The very attack that had appeared fruitless, the sacrificial charge of the devastators, had set the stage for this devastation. Their failure in weapon impact had been their success in tactical disruption. Without them, the skies would not have been open. Without their courage, the timing of the dive bombers could never have been so devastating. As smoke poured into the Pacific sky and Japanese sailors leaped into the sea to escape the burning wreckage, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted. The Japanese Navy, once an unstoppable force, had lost the strategic advantage it had built since Pearl Harbor. The Americans, on the other hand, had demonstrated that courage, timing, and intelligence could overcome even the most formidable adversary. The Battle of Midway would continue for another day, but its outcome had already been decided in those crucial morning hours. The heroism of the torpedo bomber crews, flying outdated machines into impossible odds, proved that in war, success is often built upon the backs of those who never returned. Their legacy endured, etched not in the number of enemy ships sunk, but in the decisive blow that followed in their wake. The skies over the Pacific that day had already been filled with the roar of engines and the acrid scent of burning fuel. The earlier waves of American torpedo bombers, slow, outdated, and desperately vulnerable, had suffered devastating losses, their attacks failing to damage a single Japanese ship. But their sacrifice was not in vain. In their wake, they left the Japanese carriers in a state of dangerous disorganization. Flight decks were cluttered with fueled and armed planes, hastily prepared for new launches or in the process of rearming. Anti-aircraft crews, stretched thin and fatigued by the onslaught, were caught in a moment of confusion. Communications faltered, and coordination slipped just enough to leave the fleet exposed. It was in this narrow window, measured not in hours, but in heartbeats, that the American dive bombers arrived. Flying high above the chaotic battle, squadrons Douglas head-speed dauntless aircraft, guided by veteran leaders and braving the uncertainty of a vast ocean, had managed to locate the Japanese fleet by a combination of luck, instinct, and sheer persistence. The scene that greeted them below was one of opportunity. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were fully exposed, their defensive screens thinned and air cover disorganized from the earlier torpedo attacks. It was a moment of rare vulnerability in an otherwise meticulously planned Japanese operation. The dauntless bombers began their deadly descent. Engines howled as they dropped through clouds, slicing the air at steep angles. Pilots held their courses steady, eyes locked on the narrow silhouettes of enemy flight decks. Every second brought them closer to the point of no return. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, black puffs of flak dotting the sky, but it was too late to stop the momentum. Within moments, precision guided by training and nerves of steel, the first bombs struck. Kaga was hit by multiple direct strikes that ignited the fuel and munitions stored on deck, sending fireballs into the sky. Soryu followed, her hangar deck consumed in a blast that crippled her instantly. Akagi, the flagship of Admiral Nagumo himself, was struck by a single bomb that detonated near the midsection. But the timing and location of the impact proved catastrophic. Fire spread rapidly through the vessel, fanned by open hatches and fueled by gasoline and ordnance. Each explosion tore through steel and flesh alike, reducing once proud carriers to flaming wrecks. The Japanese sailors, stunned and scrambling, fought to contain the infernos, but the damage was too severe, the shock too sudden. Within minutes, the core of Japan's striking force at Midway was mortally wounded. The pride of the Imperial Navy, 3 of its 4 front-line carriers had been knocked out in the span of less than 10 minutes. What made this moment even more astonishing was the scale of the turnaround. Just hours before, the Japanese fleet had seemed poised to deliver a decisive blow to the Americans, their planes already in the air and their commanders confident. But now, that advantage was gone. The carriers that had once launched the attack on Pearl Harbor were burning in open waters, and the strategic initiative had shifted in a heartbeat. As the dauntless bombers pulled out of their dives and banked away, the pilots could see the rising columns of smoke curling into the sky. They had risked everything on this strike, and now they were witnesses to history in the making. The silence in their cockpits was heavy not with fear, but with the weight of understanding. They knew what this meant. Back on the American carriers, the news of the successful strike was received with cautious relief. Radio reports confirmed hits, and spotters observed the towering smoke from miles away. The crews erupted in quiet celebration, not with shouts but with an overwhelming sense of vindication. The cost had been great, but the payoff was undeniable. The Japanese response was swift but desperate. Haryu, the one remaining operational carrier, launched counterstrikes that would damage the US Yorktown and briefly return fire. But her time was limited. The American forces, now emboldened, focused their remaining strength on eliminating this final threat. By the end of the day, Haryu too would be aflame, and with her loss, Japan's carrier strength at Midway was effectively wiped out. This moment, those precious few minutes of precise attack, marked a turning point in the Pacific War. It was not merely the destruction of ships, but the collapse of an entire strategy. The Japanese Navy, though still formidable, would never again hold the offensive momentum it once enjoyed. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded it since Pearl Harbor was shattered. What had begun as a gamble by a smaller American fleet had turned into a stunning triumph. The dive bombers, often overlooked and underestimated, had delivered a decisive blow at exactly the right time. Their success was not only a matter of skill and bravery but also of timing, sacrifice, and the chaos born from earlier attacks. It was a perfect storm, and in the eye of it, history had changed course. Midway would go on to be studied for decades by historians, military scholars, and tacticians alike, not just for its outcome, but for the sequence of human decisions and acts of courage that made it possible. It proved that wars are not won by numbers alone, nor by technology, but by those rare, pivotal moments when clarity meets action and opportunity is seized with both hands. As the sun dipped below the horizon on June 4, 1942, the waters of the Pacific simmered with smoke and wreckage, a silent testament to one of the most consequential days in naval history. The Battle of Midway, once teetering on a knife's edge, had reached its turning point. In the space of a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy, up until that moment a seemingly invincible force, suffered a blow so devastating that it would never again reclaim its former dominance. 4 of its prized fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later that day, Haryu, had been either sunk outright or doomed beyond salvation. The once proud hulls that carried the hopes of Japan's Pacific ambitions now burned, listing fatally into the waves. The path to this moment had been set in motion hours earlier. As US reconnaissance aircraft began spotting signs of the Japanese task force northeast of Midway, communications buzzed aboard American carriers as crews scrambled to prepare their dive bombers and torpedo planes. What followed was a chaotic, brutal ballet of air power, coordination, and chance. Torpedo squadrons, flying outdated aircraft and lacking proper fighter cover, suffered catastrophic losses. Their missions, in terms of inflicting damage, failed almost entirely. But their sacrifice was not in vain. It drew Japanese combat air patrols down to sea level, depleting fuel and disrupting defensive patterns. This window of vulnerability was all that was needed. From high above, dauntless dive bombers from US Enterprise and US Yorktown broke through the scattered clouds, caught the Japanese carriers in a moment of perilous transition. Their decks, crammed with fully fueled aircraft being wormed for a second wave, offered the perfect targets. In a matter of minutes, 3 carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were transformed from dominant war machines into smoking, twisted infernos. It was a stunning reversal of fortune. Japanese commanders, stunned by the ferocity and precision of the American strike, scrambled to salvage what they could. But it was already too late. Of the original quartet of carriers that had set out to dominate Midway and crush American resistance, only Haryu remained operational in the immediate aftermath. Striking back with tenacity, Haryu launched 2 waves of bombers that succeeded in fatally damaging the US Yorktown. The venerable American carrier, already battle-hardened from Coral Sea, fought valiantly to stay afloat, her crew displaying a level of courage and cohesion that matched the gravity of the moment. Yet the damage proved too extensive, and Yorktown would eventually be abandoned. But the fight was not over. American forces, having absorbed Haryu's counterpunch, regrouped swiftly. That evening, dauntless bombers from US Enterprise located Haryu and launched a final strike. The Japanese carrier met the same fiery fate as her sisters. Engulfed in flames, her decks rendered unusable, her engines crippled. By nightfall, the once mighty core of Japan's First Air Fleet had been reduced to burning debris scattered across the ocean. The implications of this singular day echoed far beyond the horizon. Though the United States had suffered losses, including the irreplaceable Yorktown and dozens of airmen, it retained its remaining carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, and, more importantly, had preserved its strategic position in the Pacific. Midway itself, the target of Japan's campaign, remained firmly in American hands, and the psychological shift was even more profound. For the first time since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the tide of war in the Pacific had begun to turn. Back in Japan, the loss of 4 frontline carriers and their experienced crews sent shockwaves through the Naval High Command. These were not just machines, they were the heart of Japan's carrier strike capability. Manned by the Navy's most skilled pilots and flight coordinators, their loss could not be easily replaced, neither in shipyards nor in training programs. In contrast, the United States, with its vast industrial base and rapidly expanding pilot training pipeline, now had the initiative and the capacity to press its advantage. The Battle of Midway did not end the war, but it redefined its trajectory. From this point forward, Japan would no longer be able to launch major offensives with the same overwhelming confidence. The dynamic shifted. Now, it was the United States that would dictate the tempo of war in the Pacific. Island by island, the long and grueling road toward Tokyo would begin. Midway had lit the path. Amid the fading thunder of distant gunfire and the sobering silence that followed, the men aboard American ships knew they had been part of something historic. They did not yet grasp the full magnitude of what had occurred, but they understood instinctively that the Pacific would never look the same. In the months and years to come, historians would analyze tactics, decode communications, and argue over the role of luck versus planning. But for those who lived it, Midway would remain not just a battle, but a moment of reckoning, a day when the balance of power shifted, not with grand speeches or political maneuvering, but through the bravery and sacrifice of sailors and aviators who refused to yield. It was just days after the smoke had cleared above the Pacific that military strategists and historians alike began to understand what had truly occurred at Midway. On the surface, it seemed like a stunning reversal of fortune. 4 of Japan's prized aircraft carriers reduced to smoldering wreckage beneath the waves, while the United States, though bloodied and having lost the Yorktown, still stood with its naval power intact, but beyond the dramatic exchanges of torpedoes and bombs, beyond the bravery of pilots diving into hellish fire, something more profound had taken place, a shift that would redefine naval warfare for the rest of the 20th century. Before Midway, battleships had reigned supreme. They were the floating fortresses of empire, symbols of naval prestige and power. For decades, admirals had measured a nation's maritime strength by the number of battleships in its fleet, their heavy guns and armor promising control over vast oceans. In the early days of World War II, even after the attack on Pearl Harbor, many still clung to the belief that these behemoths would be the deciding factor in any great sea battle. But at Midway, those assumptions began to crack, and what emerged from the battle's chaos was a new truth. Aircraft, not battleships, would dominate the seas from that moment on. It had started not with direct confrontation, but with shadows, blips on radar, dots on the horizon, intercepted transmissions, and desperate reconnaissance flights. The carriers, floating miles apart from each other and never even glimpsing their enemies in person, launched wave after wave of planes that struck from beyond the line of sight. It was not gun turrets that turned the tide, it was squadrons of dive bombers and torpedo planes, flown by young men who knew that many would not return. These aircraft could reach across hundreds of miles of open sea, striking with speed and precision, bypassing the armor of a battleship to ignite its vulnerable hangars and fuel lines. In the final stages of the battle, when the Japanese carrier Hiryu attempted a counterstrike after the loss of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, it still seemed that experience and tactics might salvage something from the wreckage. Hiryu's planes dealt a severe blow to the Yorktown, hitting it twice and leaving it listing and burning. But Hiryu's moment of defiance was short-lived. American scouts located it within hours. And soon, it too was under the hammer of bombs. Its decks were torn apart, its aircraft caught in fuel fires, and its crew scrambling to abandon ship. With Hiryu gone, the Japanese naval strike force had lost all of its aircraft carriers, and more critically, the skilled pilots and crew who had trained for years to wield them effectively. This loss was not just tactical, it was psychological. For Japan, which had begun the war with a near-mythic reputation for naval prowess, the destruction of its carrier force dealt a blow to its momentum and confidence. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy, which had spent months reeling from the devastation of Pearl Harbor, found in Midway a rallying point, proof that the tide could be turned, and that superior intelligence, coordination, and resilience could win the day. But the tools of that victory were not the massive dreadnoughts of the past. They were the slender, vulnerable, yet lethal aircraft and the flat-decked carriers that launched them. After Midway, the battle doctrine of every major navy began to change. Battleships, once the pride of any fleet, became secondary support platforms or bombardment tools, but no longer the primary arm of naval might. The aircraft carrier emerged as the centerpiece of maritime strategy, a mobile airbase that could strike far and retreat fast, reshaping how wars at sea would be fought. Midway was not just a turning point in the Pacific campaign, it was a revelation, a moment when the modern age of naval combat truly began. What makes this shift even more striking is how sudden and complete it was. In just a matter of days, a century of naval tradition had been overturned. The battleships that had once symbolized unassailable strength were suddenly outdated in the face of a weapon that could reach them before they even saw it coming. And the men who had flown those fateful missions, often in outdated or underperforming aircraft, against overwhelming odds, had changed the face of warfare not through brute force, but through innovation, courage, and precision. In the aftermath, American shipyards would focus their resources on building more carriers and training new waves of pilots. The lessons of Midway would be studied endlessly in war colleges, not just for their strategic value but for what they represented: a pivot point, a moment of clarity in the fog of war. Naval commanders who once boasted of gun range and armor thickness now spoke of sortie rates, radar detection, and carrier coordination. And across the Pacific, the Empire of Japan found itself suddenly on the defensive, its dreams of swift domination fading with the smoke of its sunken ships. The Battle of Midway thus stands as more than a victory. It is a testament to transformation. It was the day the world saw, undeniably, that the sky now ruled the sea. While the smoke still lingered over the waters of Midway, the consequences of the battle began to settle in, not just as a temporary blow to Japanese pride, but as a strategic catastrophe with long-lasting consequences. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had once swept across the Pacific with an air of invincibility, suddenly found itself bleeding irreplaceable strength. 4 fleet carriers Eki, Kaga, Soryu, and Heri had gone down in flames, along with over 200 of their elite aviators. These were not ordinary losses. These ships and men were the core of Japan's striking force, the same ones that had executed the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. Their destruction was more than symbolic, it was structurally devastating. Unlike the United States, Japan's war machine lacked the industrial capacity to rapidly replenish such vital losses. The Japanese shipyards, already operating near their limits, simply could not build new carriers at the pace that America's factories could. Nor could they replace the highly trained pilots, many of whom had been groomed for years in specialized programs. Japan's pilot training pipeline was rigorous but slow, producing small batches of elite aviators. After Midway, the luxury of selectivity would be replaced by hurried training programs that never truly recaptured the excellence of the early war air groups. In stark contrast, the United States was just beginning to awaken the full might of its industrial engine. New carriers were being laid down in waves. Aircraft were rolling off production lines in staggering numbers, and pilot schools were turning out fresh aviators at a scale the world had never seen. Midway marked the beginning of that shift where material and manpower supremacy would begin to tilt the balance irreversibly. The Japanese high command understood the depth of the loss, though their public announcements softened the reality. Privately, however, there was no mistaking the magnitude of the setback. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the offensive strategy, had hoped Midway would force the Americans into a decisive battle that would break their spirit. Instead, it had backfired catastrophically. The carefully planned ambush had unraveled, leaving Japan's carrier strike force crippled and its strategic initiative in ruins. Yet the true consequences of Midway went beyond the sunken ships and lost lives. With the momentum broken, Japan was forced onto the defensive far earlier than it had anticipated. The grand strategy of a perimeter defense, where a series of island bases would absorb American advances, was built on the assumption that Japan would have the initiative for at least a year. Maybe more. Midway shattered that assumption. Suddenly, the United States had the breathing room and the confidence to begin plotting its counteroffensives. And plot they did. In the months following Midway, the United States began its island-hopping campaign, aiming to bypass heavily fortified positions and capture strategic points that would bring American forces ever closer to the Japanese home islands. Guadalcanal was the first major step, a brutal campaign that began just 2 months after Midway and lasted for 6 grinding months. The tide had turned, slowly but surely, and it all traced back to that fateful week in June 1942. Psychologically, Midway also carried enormous weight. For the American public, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, it was the first unambiguous victory, proof that the tide could indeed be turned. Newspapers hailed it as a triumph, and morale soared. The perception of Japanese invincibility, cultivated by a string of early war victories, was finally broken. And for the military, Midway validated the doctrine of carrier warfare, showing that dominance in the Pacific would be determined not by battleship broadsides, but by air groups launched hundreds of miles from the target. This transformation in naval warfare had been foreshadowed at Pearl Harbor, but Midway confirmed it. The aircraft carrier was now the capital ship of the seas. Battleships, once symbols of national prestige, were increasingly relegated to escort and support roles. The Pacific would no longer be ruled by heavy armor and big guns, but by swift deploying planes, skilled pilots, and mobile strike groups capable of projecting force across entire oceans. Japan, hemmed in by its industrial limitations and strategic overreach, simply could not adapt fast enough. Its remaining carriers were fewer in number and often manned by inexperienced crews. The quality gap widened with each passing month, and the United States, now fully mobilized, poured overwhelming resources into its war effort. The momentum that Japan had relied on in the early stages of the war was gone, and with it, the hope of a negotiated settlement or a war of attrition that favored their smaller economy. Midway did not end the war, but it charted the path forward. It was the inflection point where the balance of power began to shift, not just in terms of who held the initiative, but in how the war would be fought. It taught commanders the brutal importance of intelligence, the fragility of even the strongest fleets, and the decisive impact of timing, preparation, and luck. As the sun set on the Pacific that June, the waters around Midway still shimmered with oil slicks and floating debris. But beneath the waves, the real change was already underway. The tide of war had turned, and the echoes of that shift would ripple across every battle that followed from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the beaches of Iwo Jima, until the final chapter was written in Tokyo Bay. In the end, the Battle of Midway stood not only as a testament to courage, strategy, and sacrifice, but as a clear illustration of a deeper, more enduring truth, that wars are not won by battles alone, but by the strength of a nation's entire system, its economy, infrastructure, morale, and resolve. The Japanese Navy, once thought to be nearly invincible, suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. 4 of its frontline aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Heryu, were lost in a single day, along with hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and skilled crewmen. These were not just ships and people, they were the culmination of years of investment, training, and national pride. Japan, with its limited industrial base and finite natural resources, simply could not match the scale or speed at which the United States could build, replenish, and reinforce. For every carrier Japan lost, it would take years and strained resources to replace it, if ever. Meanwhile, the United States, with its vast shipyards, factories, and manpower, was already churning out new warships, aircraft, and equipment at a pace that stunned even its own military planners. What Japan lost at Midway was not just hardware and personnel, it lost the momentum of its war effort, and with it, the initiative that had defined the early months of the Pacific conflict. In contrast, American forces left Midway battered but emboldened. The US Yorktown had been mortally wounded, but her sacrifice had not been in vain. The sailors and airmen who fought in those skies and seas had proven that courage, determination, and coordination could overcome even the most formidable odds. And most importantly, they had the full weight of an industrial superpower behind them, a nation that could replace ships faster than Japan could sink them, train pilots in droves, and move mountains of supplies across thousands of miles of ocean with growing efficiency. What followed Midway was not an immediate end to the war, but a slow and relentless push forward. Island by island, battle by battle, the Allies would claw back territory from Japanese control. Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, the Marianas, the Philippines, all of these future campaigns were made possible because of what happened at Midway. It broke the back of Japan's carrier strike force, forcing them into a defensive posture for the remainder of the war, and from that point on, the tide of war flowed inexorably toward Tokyo Bay. Still, let us not forget the cost. Every sunken ship held hundreds of lives. Every lost aircraft marked the absence of a brave pilot who would never return. The Pacific War was a brutal theater, vast, unforgiving, and deadly, but it was also a proving ground for a new kind of warfare, where intelligence, logistics, And industrial might mattered as much if not more than courage under fire. The story of Midway is more than a military tale. It is a reminder of how a nation's ability to mobilize its economy, rally its people, and adapt to unprecedented challenges can determine the fate of history. Without America's unmatched ability to rebuild its shipyards in California, its aircraft plants in the Midwest, its fuel convoys crossing the Pacific, the victory at Midway would have been an isolated success. Instead, it became a symbol of turning tides, a strategic high point from which the Allies would never look back. So as we reflect on these events, nearly a century later, we are reminded that history is made not only by the heroes on the front lines, but by the silent workers behind them, the welders, machinists, codebreakers, engineers, and countless others who, piece by piece, built the machinery of victory. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of one of history's most pivotal battles. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps us bring you more fascinating stories from the past. Until next time, sleep well, stay curious, and good night.